Hey, Walter Sorrells back with more tips for the knife maker. Today, making a competition chopper. So honestly, I've never done chopping competitions, done a lot of cutting with Japanese swords, not so much with big choppers. Now there's an organization called Blade Sports that sponsors chopping competitions, and they've got very set definitions for, you know, the size and type of knives that are usable. So I've used that as, you know, kind of parameters for this particular build. Now, I will say, if I were really going to make one for competition, wouldn't necessarily be exactly like this. This is really built around stuff that I scrounged in the shop on kind of short notice. That's the way I do a lot of these builds. But anyway, the point is to make a big, strong, robust knife that you can chop all kinds of stuff up with that'll stay sharp but won't break. All right, let's jump on into it. The materials I'll use today will be this piece of 1095 high carbon steel, a pair of Corby pins, and some stainless tube, and a pair of Australian lacewood scales. Now look, would I say that 1095 is ideal for competition choppers? No, I wouldn't. In a perfect world, I'd probably go with something a little more shock resistant, like 5160. But it's what I had on hand, so that's what I'm using. Now on top of that, I'll be differentially hardening the blade, which really toughens it up, so I have every confidence that it'll hold up just fine. I'll begin by laying out the outline for the blade. I'm working from a plan that's got all the dimensions worked out. Now, if you're interested in trying your hand at this build and also want to lay a little support on this channel, I've got plans available on my Patreon page. Link in the cards and description. Now, there are lots of fancy ways of laying out engineering plans, but you can also salvage curves from random crap lying around the shop, just like I'm doing here. At the end of the day, it serves the same function. So once that's done, I'll drill the holes in the handle. I occasionally get comments from people who think you're better off drilling holes after you do the outline of the blade. Now there are some advantages to that approach, and 15 or 20 years ago I did it that exact way. But over time I've found that, at least for me with the equipment that I've got and the way that I do it, the disadvantages of that approach totally outweigh the advantages. I've explained them at length in other videos, but maybe I'll do a Friday 5 video soon where I explain the rationale for this approach. I'll begin by spot drilling the holes on my mill. I've got 2 holes for the shanks of the Corby fasteners, then 1 for the lanyard hole, a crucial safety feature on any chopping blade and a requirement in chopping competition blades. They'll be different sizes, so I'll drill them separately. I'm using my DRO to locate everything so that I can drill the handle scales separately and not have to use the blade as a drill guide. Next, I'll turn to the grinder to profile the blade. I'm using a 40 grit combat abrasive shredder ceramic belt for profiling. I prefer used belts for this part of the process. If you go blasting away on your profiling, you can strip off a lot of abrasives in a hurry, whereas a belt that's been worn in a little holds up much better under the shearing forces created by the blade corners. I always leave my grind just a hair oversized at this point, knowing that I can perfect everything after the handle scales are installed. Competition choppers are not all about elegant design. They're about putting maximum grunt behind the cutting edge. This is 3/16 inch thick stock. If I were making this for real competition, I'd probably go with thicker stock just to give it more mojo. But honestly, I'm not an expert in the way that these are configured, so this is just my attempt at one of these things. Now I've got the general shape established, so it's time to grind the bevels. I'll use this little scribe to mark a pair of center references. By grinding to the lines, I'll know that I've got a symmetrical grind. Now for the bevels. In this case, I'm using a nice fresh ceramic belt, again starting with a 40 grit ceramic. The grind line in this case is very simple. It's just a straight line running parallel to the spine. Grinding straight lines is the most technically difficult aspect of grinding and takes a lot of practice. A 10-inch line like this is extremely difficult to get right. You can use grinding jigs to improve your lines, but even a grinding jig won't give you a perfectly straight line across a 10-inch span like this. The only way to get there is practice and patience. Now 40 grit belts grind very aggressively, so to avoid overshooting and creating a problem I can't fix, I'll move to successively higher grit belts as I get closer to my target, allowing me to slow down and just kind of nudge that grind line up closer to my goal. By the time I reach my 120 grit ceramic belt, the lines are getting a lot closer to acceptable. So the final grind at even higher grit belts will happen after heat treating. Hey guys, quick sponsor break here. I used to use 60 grit aluminum oxide for roughing. Those belts have their place, but after I discovered ceramics a few years back, wow, big difference. They're faster, they're cooler, they're much longer lasting. Want to try some out for yourself? Our sponsor, Combat Abrasives, sells a value pack of their Shredder ceramic abrasive belts that will give you a chance to try them out at a good price. These are great belts, great prices, and I use them literally every day in this shop. They make this stuff too, Rogue Epoxy. You can see it later in the video. They're American owned, family run. Check out their full line of abrasive belts at combatabrasives.com. Now we're ready to harden the blade. I'll be differentially hardening this blade, which will create a Hamon. I'm not really focusing on the Hamon here because the minute you chop something with a polished Hamon, your polish goes out the window. More on that later. Anyway, I've mixed up a refractory cement called Satanite and coated the blade with it. You want the cement dry when it goes into the forge. If you don't, it'll boil out and knock all the clay off as soon as you stick it in the fire. We're not trying to cure this like we would if it was structural concrete or something. Drying overnight works fine, but you can speed it up with a torch or a heat gun. Now for the fun part. I have more ways of quenching blades than you can shake a stick at, but here's one of them. 1095 is on the borderline between oil and water hardening steel. Water hardening will assure that my Hamon will come out just the way I want it, but it's a great way to crack blades. Oil hardening, on the other hand, is much safer, but to my taste, it doesn't give me as good a Hamon. So, my solution is to quench briefly in water, then finish in oil. There are a lot of nerdy qualifications and nuances that I could get into here about how I do this and some of the little details, but I'm not going to go into all that here. Bottom line, I heat it just past non-magnetic, aiming it around 1500 Fahrenheit, then a second or two in water. Boom, into oil. Perfect. File skates across the steel so we know it's nice and hard. After carefully stripping off the clay, careful because I don't want the blade to crack while it's still really brittle, I'll temper the steel at 400 degrees Fahrenheit. Fun fact, you might notice at this point that the blade has curved slightly toward the spine. That's the effect of water quenching, the same thing that induces the curvature in Japanese swords. Quench in oil alone, and the curve will reverse, curving down toward the cutting edge. After tempering, I'll polish up the flats a little, then move back to the grinder and even up the grind lines. If you're trying this, be prepared for some frustration. It's just not easy. I've moved to a 220 grit aluminum oxide belt now. For a working blade, that's where I'm going to stop. A little bit of back and forth between polishing the flat and the belt grinder, and I'm ready to work on the handles. I'm using Australian lacewood scales here. You can buy scales pre-cut from knife making supply places, but I typically buy bigger chunks of lumber and slice them up on my bandsaw. Way cheaper. It does mean you have to spend a little time on the disc grinder, getting everything good and flat. Of course, if you don't have a disc grinder, you can do this by hand on sandpaper. I've shown how to do that in plenty of other videos. Earlier, while I had everything set up for drilling the holes in the tang of the blade, I also drilled the handle scales. Yet another reason why I prefer to drill the holes at the beginning of the process. As any machinist will tell you, setting up fixtures is the biggest time waster in the shop. It has to be done, but if you're constantly setting things up and tearing it down, setting it up and tearing it down, it just wastes a lot of time. So the fewer setups you have, the more knives you'll make and the less time you spend setting things up. Again, this is kind of mill specific and doesn't apply if you're using a drill press. But basically I just flip the scales face down, in other words, with the inside faces down, so that I'm completely assured of squareness, then use the DRO to drill the exact same dimensions that I used on the handle. Now because I'm using corby fasteners, I'll also need to counterbore the scales for the heads of the corby fasteners. Normally I'd use a step drill specifically made for this size of corby, but in this case I can drill them instead. A little bit of simple math tells you exactly how deep to go. Again, I'm using the DRO, but on a drill press you can just set the depth on your quill stop and get the exact same result. Now I'll shape the front face of the scale. This little part right here. You can't really do this once the scales are attached, so I'll draw the line, then cut it on my bandsaw. Then to the disc grinder, and a little finish work by hand. Using the corbies as locator pins, I'll trace the lines and trim them on the bandsaw. I always leave plenty of excess to allow for screw-ups. Grinding wood is a lot easier than redoing all the lines of the blade because you chewed a 1/16 of an inch too deep on the bandsaw. And it's time to attach the handles. A quick degrease followed by a little Scotch-Brite and the surface is ready for epoxy. The key thing in putting on the handle is to lay out everything and figure out what you're going to do ahead of time. Nothing more irritating than chasing around your shop for clamps or screwdrivers while the epoxy's going gummy on you. I only forgot one tool today, which is pretty good by my standards. And now we blast away. For safety reasons, gloves are highly recommended when working with epoxy. The problem is that you can't feel the epoxy on your fingers with gloves on, which can result in getting epoxy on things you really don't want epoxy on. Now, if you're making a boat hull or a bathtub in an industrial setting, there's no downside to wearing gloves, because you're just getting epoxy everywhere. But in something like this that's kind of precision, it can be a little bit of a pain in the neck. When you're trying to clean squeeze out, gloves can actually cause you to mess things up even worse by dragging epoxy all over the place. After the epoxy cures, it's time to shape the handle and bring the lines of the knife to their final dimensions. I'll begin by hogging off material with a good fresh ceramic belt. Once that's done, we'll tune the lines. My guys at Combat Abrasives just sent me a pretty cool product. This is a scalloped edge 1-inch belt. You can get 2-inch scalloped belts, but here's where these come in really handy. Blending your lines in these small radius curves is always a little tricky, but these thin and very flexible little belts with the scallops on the side allow you to really go into tight corners without digging trenches in your handle. You want to run it on a slack belt setup, which allows maximum play to the flexibility of the belt. There are any number of ways of finishing handle like this. Oil, various kinds of varnishes, whatever, but I'm going to go the simplest method and just add a little furniture wax. Once that's complete, I'll hit the lanyard tube with a countersink bit, adding a chamfer to the tube so it doesn't saw your lanyard in half. Let me return to something I alluded to earlier. Normally when I make a blade with a Hamon, I go through a fairly elaborate process of etching and polishing to bring out the Hamon. Not here though. While you can easily see the Hamon with the naked eye, I haven't done my usual polish. Why not? Because this blade is made for chopping nasty abrasive stuff. The minute you hack into a 2x4, that's the end of your polish. So, why bother? Hey, speaking of, will she chop? I'm no competition chopper champ, but that seems like the right general idea. Thanks for watching, guys. If you feel like you got something out of this video, don't forget to subscribe. Also, click on the link to Patreon for a great way to give back to the channel. Plus, check me out on Instagram, Facebook, Twitter. Links in the description. If you want something sharp and pointy, maybe a gift for yourself or one of the cooler people in your life, check out my Tactics Armory website and pick up one of our tactical or outdoor knives. And finally, if you want to learn to make Hamons or Japanese swords, check out waltersorrellsblades.com, where you can find videos about how I make Hamons, as well as forging, mounting, polishing, and fittings for Japanese swords. Thanks, and see you soon.